Thank you all so much for being here this morning. I know we have initially quite a bit of interest in this case. Let me start off by telling you that we've got a couple of complexities that will make it difficult for me to release all the information that we will ultimately release. First, we have Marcy's Law, which is our new constitutional amendment, which prevents us from releasing information that would identify or tend to identify victims of a violent crime. And so Marcy's Law is going to be in effect here this morning. We also have the deputies that were involved in the shooting have not been debriefed yet. This is a very active crime scene, and so they're still with us at the office, and their statements have not been taken. And also, we haven't searched the scene yet. So this thing started at about just a little before 4 o'clock this morning, and we just now are able to get a search warrant here to begin the search. So we haven't positively identified either of our two deceased people that are here on the scene. So here's what we have, and then I'll of course stop and try to answer some questions. At 3:37 this morning, our 911 dispatch center got a call basically saying this, that a neighbor called and said that the first call we got at 3:37 was actually gunshots in the area. You can see we're at Parkwood and Dixie Ross here in Martin County. So the first call comes in, people from as far east from here, several blocks, called and said that they heard gunshots. Then we got a 911 call from a person who lives close by on this street, who said that that her neighbor was at her house and that she heard gunshots. And while she was talking, she said that her house actually had been hit with gunfire. So our deputies were starting to arrive in the area because of the initial call that came in of shots in the area. So they were responding, for all practical purposes, to an active shooter. We had 3 deputies initially approach the neighbor's house to begin to get information. When our deputies noticed what we now know to be a gunshot victim in the front yard of one of the houses here on Dixie Ross. As one of the deputies was approaching that man who had been shot, 2 other deputies took up positions on the other side of that house, close proximity, when a garage door at that house either opened or was open. We have to determine that. And an offender came out and opened fire on the first deputy that was there, approaching a gunshot victim to give aid. So now we have the one deputy who's trying to get to a gunshot victim to render aid is now being fired upon. That deputy and 2 other deputies returned gunfire and striking that offender at least more than once, multiple times, and he ended up dying from those wounds. So both gunshot people are dead. One of them is an offender. One of them, we're not sure what happened. We don't know yet the relationship between the 2 people. We don't know what precipitated the gunfire from the offender who we shot. We did a search of the house to make sure there were no additional victims. Doing that, we found the dog had been shot. We're not sure yet who shot the dog. And that's really pretty much the summary of what we have. So I'll be glad to try to answer some questions, maybe to make it easier for me. I'll just start over here. Will, if you don't mind, I'll save you for last. But I'm going to do that because your questions sometimes can be a little more complex, and maybe you'll get your answers first. So are there any questions over here?
So deputies do we think that the suspect lived in the home that y'all went in and investigated?
Right, your question is, were there any deputies hurt? The answer is no. And then do we think the person we shot lived in that house? That's our working theory. We're not sure, but we do think that it was his house he was coming out of from the garage when he opened fire on our deputies.
And were the 2 men that died, did they die on the way to the hospital, at the hospital, here?
Yeah, your question is, did they both die here on the way to the hospital? They both died here, and both of them are still here at the scene. We're waiting for the search warrant.
Now, the neighbor called and said that her home was struck in the midst of her making that 911 call. Where exactly does she live in proximity to the home at which the scene happened?
Right.
And where in her home was it struck?
Yeah, your question is, what's her proximity to the first house where the offender was shot, and where was her house hit? We discussed this. We knew this question would come up, but I think because of Marcy's law, which says I cannot release information that would tend to identify a victim, and they are victims of an aggravated assault because their house was shot at. We can't release that. But her house was hit in the front, at the door, at the side. I think from what I'm getting from the scene, and we'll know more as we do the search warrant. You can see we have an entire forensic section here. We'll know a lot more, but it was multiple times that house was hit. Yes, sir.
Yeah, do you know at least, is there any connection between the person who shot at the deputies and the person who may have killed the person your deputies were tending to?
Yeah, your question is what do we know what the relationship is between the two deceased? And the answer is we don't know. I would just have to speculate. We don't know, and we're not sure, really. We haven't done any positive IDs. We haven't notified next of kin. So we still have a lot of work to do. Once we identify who they are, we verify that one of the ones that is dead, which is the one we shot, once we verify that he lives there, then we can work on next of kin, and then we can also work on the second deceased to find out who that next of kin might be.
And a follow-up to that, you said there were like multiple gunshots, correct, that hit the neighbor's house. And does that mean there may have been other shooters?
Yeah, your question was, there were multiple gunshots that hit the neighbor's house. The answer is correct. And do we infer from that that possibly there were multiple shooters? We don't know. It appears right now that the offender that we shot was based on the fact that the neighbor called in and said, "It's my neighbor." She recognized the voice opening fire on her house. I think that's what we're going to find out, but that's not for sure yet.
What's the condition of the dog?
The condition of the dog is expired. So one of these two shot and killed that dog.
And what can you say about your deputies in this situation? You know, you have a deputy tending to a victim
Yeah.
to then get fired on.
Yeah, so your question, what can I say about our deputies that were attempting to render aid or going to render aid and were fired on? I hate to say it, but I think this is something that we're seeing nationally. I think that the numbers, Christine, my PIO, told me this morning, is we've had 10 officers shot and killed in the United States so far this month, Christine. So far this month, we've lost 10. And this guy got off some rounds before we returned fire. So we could have had 2, 3 more here. I mean, obviously, I think we're going to find he had a semi-auto, probably a high-capacity magazine, multiple, at least maybe as many as 10 shots into his neighbors. He was clearly able to reload, or apparently able to reload, and so we could have been in trouble. He actually picked on the wrong deputies to fire on because 2 of them were SWAT team members. And I'm glad it ended up like this. We don't ever want to shoot anybody, but my first concern is always my deputies. But now I have three of my deputies on administrative leave off of 1 shift, so we have a lot to contend with.
And how are they doing?
Yeah, your question, how they're doing? Well, they're professionals, and you know, none of us ever want to shoot anybody, but this was a clear case of self-defense. It was return gunfire or be shot. I mean, obviously, it was just one of those clear-cut cases.
So just to clarify, we don't know how many rounds were unloaded because you're still searching the scene, and we don't know what weapon the suspect used.
Yeah, your question, we don't know how many rounds, or what was the second part?
The weapon.
The weapon, no, we don't know. I do know, if you look down the scene later, there's a white Tahoe, like the one I drive, right behind me. That lieutenant was just getting out of his car when the offender that we shot and killed opened fire, and he ducked down behind the car as bullets whizzed over his head into this tree line. So it was a pretty intense gun battle, for sure, no question about it.
And was there a gun found by the initial victim that y'all were treating, the guy aware
Oh,
of this
yeah, your
person?
question is that did the one we were rendering aid to, was there a gun near him? We don't know yet. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. I was here. It was very dark, and we have to be careful because we're initially we don't know what we have, so we don't do anything till the state attorney gets here, until we get a search warrant, and now we'll pretty soon they should roll in with the search warrant. We'll know a lot more here shortly, but time is on our side, and waiting for a search warrant is the best policy.
Was the initial shooting inside of the home, or was it outside the home? I know you said the victim was outside.
Was the initial shooting inside the home or outside? The initial shooting, everything occurs outside. So the offender we shot was firing outside, firing at his neighbor's house, and then fired at us somewhere near the garage. It's hard for me to tell. I've looked at the scene. He was either barely inside the garage or just outside the garage. And he was as close as I am to the reporter there in the blue. It was a close contact gunfight.
Do you believe that they knew each other?
Do I believe they knew each other? I think that's a reasonable conjecture. I just don't know the answer.
Do you know if they both stayed at the house, or did the house belong to one person? Any other people lived at the house?
Do I know if they both lived at the house? The answer is I don't know for sure. We know the one offender that we shot lives there, and we don't think anybody else lives at the house.
The offender that you shot lives there,
Yes.
but the victim.
The offender that we shot lives there. The other person that we were trying to render aid to, who's deceased at the house, we don't yet know who he is or where he lives.
Where was he shot?
Where?
Where was the victim shot that you were rendering aid to?
The victim was shot, I don't know yet. He was alive when we got here, just to clarify. That person that we were trying to render aid to was alive and was talking. We don't know yet what he said, but he was definitely alive. But in the gunfire that ensued, we were not able to get to him look, there may have been fatal rounds no matter what, but it is tragic that law enforcement is right there moving to render aid, and then they're engaged in a gun battle.
And what's next with your deputies, with the investigation? What exactly are you guys doing right now?
Your question is what's next with the deputies? They'll have a time to collect themselves, and they'll be represented by their PBA representative, and we'll eventually offer them an opportunity to talk to us. But what we're doing now is we have almost our entire crime scene section is here. It's a pretty big scene. We have gunfire between law enforcement and the deceased. We have gunfire into a innocent neighbor's house. There's a lot going on here, so it's going to be all morning. We'll be here processing this scene.
What's the history of service calls to the home of the scene of the crime? Do we have any continuous, run-in with the law?
What's the call log here? We've been out here at least once for a routine auto burglary, and then I think there was a barking dog kind of call. It's all on our computer-assisted dispatch log. We'll give it all to you, but there was nothing remarkable about this house at all. It was not on our radar. It's not some house we were watching or knew about.
Which address, which house is it?
We're not releasing addresses because of Marcy's law. I want to be really careful with this. I think, Will, you have a question?
I was saving all my questions for last, like you said. So you're not releasing the address of the house where I guess the offender lived and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, the question is, we're not releasing the offender's address. The answer is yes. The problem is his proximity, that house's proximity to the neighbor's house that was fired upon, so that would trigger a Marcy's law.
Okay, how were the two individuals, the offender who shot at the deputies and the deceased male that you guys, I guess, were rendering aid to, are they both adults? Your question is, were they both adults? Yes. Both deceased people are at least middle-aged men. Okay, and can you estimate roughly how many rounds were fired between deputies and the offender in all this? Are we talking like 30, 15? How many rounds were fired in total? I don't know. But we know that the neighbor's house was hit multiple times. We know we had
I think at least 5 people called, and it'll all be borne out by our dispatch log reporting gunfire. My initial sense is that our deputies did not fire that many rounds, but 3 of them apparently did fire.
So three.
But theirs would have been a controlled fire, and we'll know what they did. That's why forensics is here, trying to figure out what the offender did.
So, but 3 deputies fired their weapons,
3 deputies fired their
and
weapons.
the offender fired a number of times at the deputy who was trying to render aid.
Yeah, so yeah, the offender fired at a neighbor, the deputy, and fired at our deputies. We just don't know how many rounds he fired.
Did you guys see anything in plain view when you got here, like drugs or that type of stuff?
Question: do we see anything in plain view? The answer is no, because that would have been a welfare check to make sure there were no additional victims. So we're very careful about that because of Fourth Amendment search and seizure requirements. They went in, cleared the house. Fortunately, I have several SWAT operators that work uniform patrol, and so they were able to gear up using tac gear and night vision and everything they have, and go in the house and safely clear it, make sure there were no other offenders and there were no other victims.
How long did this whole thing take, do you think? The whole deputies get here, the gunfight and everything's over.
How long did the whole scene last? I don't know, Will. I know it wasn't terribly long. From the time we arrived till the time we were engaged by the offender was not many minutes. It happened fast. And they were able to neutralize him immediately, and then clearing the house wouldn't have taken that long. And everything else has just been hurry up and wait until the state attorney and the judge get us that search warrant.
One more. Forgive me if you already said this, but how many weapons were recovered from the scene?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
How many weapons were recovered?
Yeah, the question, how many weapons? We haven't recovered anything yet, and I'm sure my initial teams that went in would have, if their guns are in plain view, would have seen them. We just don't know because we haven't taken their statements yet.
Well, there was at least one gun on the person who fired at the deputies, though, correct?
Your question again?
There was at least one gun from the person who fired on your deputies, though.
Yeah, your question is there's one gun that should be there that the offender fired? Yes, it should be there. We haven't seen it yet, just because we haven't executed the search warrant. So maybe I'll close with this thought. Kind of one I started with. We're seeing an unusual level of violence aimed at law enforcement. And so I tell our guys all the time, and gals, and I know my director of law enforcement, my detective captain, John Cummings here, we remind them all the time that the quiet of the night can be broken very quickly by 1 minute you're driving on routine patrols, 3:30 in the morning in Martin County, and the next thing you know, you're in a close contact gun battle. And law enforcement all over the country is facing this. It's not us. We're not outliers. And just the level of violence directed towards our deputies in the last 6 months has been, I think, unprecedented. So we'll continue being alert, and we thank you all so much for being here this morning.